welcome to the Vigilante Dialogues. I am your host, Shaina Smith, welcoming you to the National Boardroom. As always, we hope to have a stimulating conversation tonight, and with me I have Dr. Michael E. O'Neill. He's an anthropologist and former college president. He's a director of Joma Properties, a family-owned real estate management company. He currently serves as a senior research fellow at Island Resources Foundation, which is a Washington, D.C.-based organization whose central mission is to assist small islands to meet the challenges of social, economic, and institutional growth while protecting and enhancing their environments. Dr. Michael O'Neill is no stranger to most of us, so Doc, welcome.
Thank you.
We have been trying to track you down for a long time.
Yes,
Gotta let everybody know.
I know.
He's been long overdue to the National Boardroom, so I'm excited about our conversation tonight about around the book that he wrote that was published in 2012, Slavery, Smallholding and Tourism. And I think it's a very important piece of work in terms of capturing the history of the country, something that, you know, I hold dear, being that, you know, I so strongly feel we need to have Virgin Islands history in our primary schools so that we can have an appreciation of what we have now, because we have the correct reference point for it. So Dr. O'Neill, welcome again, and let's talk about, you know, how this came into being. I read in an article that this was started from as far back as 1983.
Well, the book, Slavery, Smallholding and Tourism, the subtitle of which is Social Transformations in the British Virgin Islands, which gives, I think, a more complete sense of what it is about. It actually had its first incarnation as a doctoral dissertation, which was completed in 1983. But the research, of course, that led to that began even before that, from the late 1970s. The interesting thing is that it existed as a doctoral dissertation within what is called the gray literature of academe. But while it was accessible to scholars in the field, specialists who were interested in that sort of thing, it wasn't really readily accessible to the rest. And so, ironically, after I left academe, when I, you know, left the college, I decided to revisit it. And in fact, found a publisher. I was referred to a publisher who would be interested in something like this. They publish mainly, interestingly, legal works, or law and society works. But I suspect that the interest, their interest in the book or the manuscript, resided at least in part because there's a substantial amount of court records that are used in the book and analyzed. So again, while it existed prior to 2012, it really wasn't accessible. So I'm certainly happy, and I hope others are, that it's more readily accessible now.
So where can persons actually purchase the book?
Oh, you jump to the end.
Yeah, jump to the end. While we're here and I'm thinking on it.
No, thank you. I mean, thank you. It's been available locally at the various booksellers, National Education Services, Dr. Wheatley's bookshop. Island Services has had it, Roots on Main Street, which is a store right across from the Island Sun. But they all run out. I mean, so people tell me, oh, I've gone to this or that and I haven't found it, because one might have it, the other might not. The other place, though, which I think has regularly had it, has been the college's bookstore. But apart from that, of course, it's available on Amazon in both print and ebook, Kindle versions.
Great. Yes, I have my Kindle version. Okay, so you said that it started in 1983 as far as it was published as a dissertation. So what was the approach that you took in terms of bringing this forth?
Well, a little bit of background on why I did it. In the 1970s, actually, late 70s, when I began working on this, I was motivated to a large extent by the fact that there really didn't exist very much at that time in terms of socio-cultural work upon which Virgin Islanders could draw as we look to, you know, chart a way for ourselves. Early work that had been done, scholarly work, was done by an anthropologist from Brandeis. I think it was in 1963. It was entitled Social Stratification in Tortola, British Virgin Islands. The anthropologist's name was Shushila Raghavan. It was a master's thesis.
Okay.
I don't think is readily available anymore.
Mm.
Subsequent to that, there was another anthropologist, Robert Dirks, who did his dissertation work here, and he completed his work in 1973, I think it was.
Okay.
And then we come upon the seminal work of two local scholars, the late doctors Norwell Harrigan and Pearl Barlack,
Okay.
who published in 1975 their seminal work, The Virgin Islands Story. In that same year, Dr. Isaac Ducan published his History of the British Virgin Islands, which derived from his own doctoral dissertation, which he did at the University of the West Indies.
Okay.
And then there was sort of a hiatus between then and, I suppose, Frank McGlynn, another anthropologist, who did his research in the eastern end of the island, Long Look East End, and he completed and did his dissertation in 1980, I think he completed his work.
So we've been a little hub for a lot of research?
Yeah, but again, much of this, except possibly for the work of Drs. Harrigan and Barlack, were never really published.
Okay. For general consumption.
Right, they were all scholarly works available in what is called the gray literature of academia.
Okay.
And so then my work was done and finished in 1983. At that same year, 1983, you had Vernon Pickering's History of the Virgin Islands, which was published. And I think shortly after that, 83, you have another scholarly work, a doctoral dissertation by Dr. Bernie Harrigan. And then since then, there have been a number of others.
Okay.
Recently, and I mean, I run the risk, of course, of missing names, but some that come to mind, Dr. Pat Turnbull, Dr. Kathy Smith, Dr. Mitch Kent, and most recently Dr. Angel Smith, who is now the director of the Virgin Islands program. Now, all of these, the latter ones that I mentioned, are doctoral dissertations. So they remain in the gray literature. So, but that's the background and the motivation that led to my undertaking this work in the 1970s, 1980.
Okay, beautiful. So, in terms of the research, how you approached it?
How did I approach it? Well, it's a study, to describe it a little more fully. It's a study of the socioeconomic transformation of the British Virgin Islands over time, from the plantation era through the evolution of a smallholding economy to the more recent development of a tourism-based economy. The study ends, as you suggest, in 1983. So the financial services sector was not yet fully developed. It was just on the cusp of development. But my study ends with the ascendancy of tourism. Although there are allusions to the beginnings of the consolidation of financial services in the latter part of the book. But that's not the core of it. So the approach was archival, using court records, planters' reports, travelers' accounts with respect to the plantation era. The period which I refer to as the smallholding economy, which is sometimes referred to as the peasant economy, but with which I took issue, that
which
was
is
approached,
the farming and the subsistence.
Right. Well, the period that followed the end of the plantation era. That was approached largely by archival works such as remained. And it bears noting that one of the challenges with respect to a lot of this period resided in the fact that even though there may have been bibliographic records available, or bibliographic notations available, the records may no longer have existed. There was a fire that took place. Well, many of the records from the Virgin Islands colony were transferred to Antigua for safekeeping, to the archives there. But they were burned in a fire which took place in 1950 in Antigua. So even though you find bibliographic references, the actual documents don't exist, at least not in Antigua. Some do, of course, in England. So that's the smallholding period. For the tourism-based economy, that work was generated, or that body of work or research was generated by my own ethnographic field work, basically. As well as what was then becoming is still very young field of tourism studies.
Okay.
They're very nascent, but there was a small body of work which was beginning to be generated about tourism as well.
Around the industry.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the ways in which you trace the development of the Virgin Islands economy was through the population statistics, and you gave some points in history where you had the first census was done in 1717. We had a population of 1,342, which is broken down 547 blacks, 795 whites. Then there was an 1805 census where the population went up to 10,520. So 9,220 blacks, 1,300 whites. But the population at the time of the abolition of slavery in 1834 stood at 6,818. What's the significance of these figures?
It's useful to look at the trajectory of the development of the territory via the demographic statistics. It's a useful entry into the landscape, if you will. The earlier statistics, the lower figures, relate to the fact that, and this is often not generally recognized, the early economy of the Virgin Islands colony was not based on sugar, as is often assumed, but rather primarily on cotton. And the cultivation of cotton is less labor intensive than that of sugar.
Okay.
So you see the population rising, particularly the black population, the African population rising as the economy shifted to the more labor intensive or labor demanding of sugar. So you have a consequent rise in the black population.
Okay.
And as you suggest there from the statistics you read, it peaked in the census of 1805, I think. In fact, it reached a point which was never again approached until really in the 20th century.
Okay.
It declined consonant with the decline of the economy. And particularly the white population, you notice, was almost completely obliterated.
Yeah, you went from 1,300 to 477. So that's
right.
That's less than half.
By the early 1900s, it was really in the teens, and I think in 1902 there were 2.
Okay.
Now, the reason for that was that the white population was here because of its involvement in the plantation economy. When the plantation economy died, there was no reason for them to remain here, or they couldn't remain here.
Yeah.
Their social reproductive capability was gone.
Yeah.
And so they left.
Okay.
But the erstwhile slaves and their descendants had nowhere to go. So they remained, and over time, their numbers increased.
Okay. So tell us about the Nottingham Free People.
Well, the Nottingham Free People, so-called, refer to a group of slaves who were manumitted by the Quakers Samuel and Mary Nottingham, who manumitted or freed them in 1776 and deeded to them in perpetuity their 50-acre estate in Longlook, or the estate was called Longlook, and the area is still known as Longlook. Now, the significance of this, the Nottingham Free People, is that they became a pivotal instance in the debate which took place in Parliament about the viability of freedom versus slavery in the abolition debates in Parliament.
Okay. Yeah, because this was well before.
That's right, and that's the crucial point, because 1776 was before Britain either abolished the slave trade or abolished slavery. And so here you have a group of freed slaves, not only freed but land owning within the context of a still slaveholding society. And so in the parliamentary debate, there were 2 sides. Those who argued for the continuation of slavery tried to show that in freedom, the Nottingham slaves had frittered away their bequest, that they were sort of lazy, no account set.
Not making any use of it.
Exactly. While those on the other side of the argument tried to show or argue that in fact in freedom they thrived.
Okay.
So I mean so what I do is I use the debate, the documents that derive from this debate in Parliament, and analyze those documents, actually present them and analyze them.
Awesome.
And one of the things that comes out interestingly is you see names, family names that exist today, of course, and that existed then. And some of the, if you will, the career trajectories of family names remain, at least consistent over the years. One of the names that I remember that stood out from the Nottingham Free People debate was a Jasper Rapsat. It's spelled in the document R-A-P-S-O-T, but we know that name as Rapsat from Nottingham, from out of that end of the island. And the Jasper Rapsat, or Rapsat, was a shipwright.
Okay.
And of course, the Rapsat family have been
known
historically
as boat builders.
shipwrights and boat builders and captains and seafaring people. And there are other names that appear in that those documents, Gordon, and so on and so forth, which resonate even today.
And I think that's such an important thing in terms of, in our history, to know that what was happening here in the Virgin Islands was actually playing a significant role in moving that debate towards the abolition of slavery, to say that, you know, this is what's taking place here, and this can be used for the argument against slavery and the need to abolish it. So that's very
well, it was
key.
used. Bear in mind, it was used on both sides.
Yeah, I imagine.
But yes, the significant point is it was a significant part of the debate that occurred in Parliament.
Yeah, because the English Empire, we know, was, you know, global.
Yes.
So the fact that they picked on a little territory.
The other thing that is interesting about the Nottingham Free People is that even though they were, the deed of manumission was initially signed by Samuel and Mary Nottingham, who at the time that they signed the manumission, the deed of manumission, resided in Long Island in New York, Quakers. It took several years, 8 years or more, before the freedom, the manumission was actually put into effect for a number of reasons. The war, which occurred short, the War of American Independence, transmission of legal documentation, and so on. And it's not clear, in fact, how long after the documents were actually even registered here, it might have taken for the actual full freedom to
take place.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You've been tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I have with me Dr. Michael O'Neill, and he's talking about his book, Slavery, Smallholding and Tourism. So we're going to take a break for a word from our sponsors and be right back. Welcome back. You're tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I am your host, Shaina Smith, and with me this evening, I'm speaking with the author of Slavery, Smallholding and Tourism, Dr. Michael O'Neill. And he's been educating us a bit about our invaluable Virgin Islands history. It's very important that we know, where we came from in order to know where we're going. So we do appreciate you taking the time to even compile this. As we were talking earlier, there's a lot of things that exist in the gray academia. You said you refer to it as the gray literature. And something that's out there for public consumption in terms of the general public being able to access that information is very key. So share with us, there was something else in the book. You talked about the court trial that dealt with the Josiah's Bay Estate Rebellion in 1823. What was that about?
Well, in 1823, a rebellion of sorts occurred on the Josiah's Bay plantation, which belonged to an absentee planter by the name of Isaac Pickering.
Okay.
As a result of this rebellion, 5 slaves were brought to trial and charged with rebellion, with insubordination, and so on, theft and other charges. What I've done in the book with respect to the 1823 trial was I used the court records and present them in great detail and analyze them, a process of exegesis, textual exegesis, and look at what occurred. And the interesting thing about using the court records is that you get a fairly rare glimpse at slaves and masters interacting. Of course, it's a biased portrayal because
the planters wrote it.
The planters, the planters were brought charges against slaves. And so the court record, of course, is from the planter's view by and large. But nonetheless, you get an unusual glimpse into the social relations of production in what even at that point was the beginning of the declining years of plantation economy in the Virgin Islands colony. The result of the trial was that the 5 slaves charged were found guilty. They were sentenced to be, they were flogged with the cat o' nine tails several times. But the more important outcome, I suppose, apart from, of course, the physical brutality of being flogged with the cat o' nine tails, was that they were sentenced to transportation. That is the term, more or less legal term. They were sentenced to transportation to the colony of Trinidad.
Okay.
What does that mean? By 1823, of course, the British had abolished the slave trade, and more particularly had abolished intercolonial slave trading, if you will. But the way to get around that was to have that species of property sentenced to transportation, where they would be sent to the then more recently established colonies, plantation colonies of Trinidad and Guyana.
Okay.
Where there was a demand for, and there would be a greater, if you will, return, economic return on...
For the labor.
Well, on the ownership, on that species of property. So whereas you had a declining economy here, there was a demand which could be met by selling, or exporting those slaves to other colonies where there was an increase.
But because of the abolition of the slave trade, they couldn't say they were trading them.
That's right. Okay. They had to be sentenced to transportation.
Okay.
And so that's the ultimate outcome of that trial. Okay. But there's a lengthy and a voluminous court record that is in the book and which is analyzed, and it's fascinating to read. You get a sense of the various testimonies that are presented of slave master relations in a declining economy. And at the end of the day, the reason why the slaves were able to in a sense carry out their acts of rebellion and insubordination with relative impunity was because of the small number of whites who were here, and the distance from the nearest military bastions, St. Kitts, Antigua.
So in terms of, you said in the book that there was a period of 100 years between the end of the plantation era and the rise of tourism as a development strategy, and you refer to a post-emancipation interregnum. I was joking with the guys outside, and I was like, I have to ask him, what is an interregnum? But what happened to the Virgin Islands in terms of that sequel after slavery, and when we were able to basically, I guess for me it's kind of like saying we got our bearings and were able to chart a way forward?
Well, we didn't quite get our bearings yet.
No, okay.
In 1864, I suggest that 1864, the sale of several encumbered plantations, property that belonged still to the planter class, was sold at public vendue because they were in debt.
Yeah.
And ironically, those who were able to buy them were
former slaves.
And so in 1864, in that sale, in that auction, if you will, of several estates, several of which, names of which you would know. Johnson's Gut, for example, was sold and fell into the hands of native Virgin Islanders, if you will, the descendants of former slaves. Capoon's Bay was another one down at the west, and several others. I suggest that 1864, therefore, is the symbolic and effective end of the plantation era. So that's
where the land ownership transfer started to happen.
Yes.
Okay.
So what I suggest is that between 1864 and the early 1960s, you have this interregnum. Interregnum means between reigns, between periods, between dominant periods.
Okay.
A period of 100 years, more or less, where nothing much happened. But there was no interest. There was no imperial interest in the Virgin Islands colony, because it wasn't producing anything which interested
significant,
which interested the imperial, which was imperial interest. But of course, the erstwhile slaves and their descendants remained here and had to eke out an existence on their own, and they managed to do that by virtue of the means of production that they had developed over time. And that amounted to subsistence farming, livestock, fishing, charcoal burning and selling, mainly to the Danish West Indies initially, which then became the U.S. Virgin Islands in 1917. So that's what I refer to as this interregnum, the period between that period.
And as you talked about the land ownership, why was it possible here, or why did it happen here versus in other Caribbean islands?
Well, in other Caribbean islands where, see, part of my argument is that, and it's an argument which I share actually with another anthropologist by the name of Professor Ulf Hennertz. He came up with the term the other Caribbean. And by that, the other Caribbean, he means those agriculturally marginal countries historically. Because I mean, let's be frank. Historically, the Virgin Islands colony was fairly marginal agriculturally as compared to countries like Jamaica, Antigua, and so on, which had different topography, were more viable in terms of sugar plantation economy. The topography here, the hilly terrain and so on, meant that it was really only viable as a sugar plantation economy when there was what today we would probably call a bullish market in Europe. When that no longer existed,
the demand has gone away, so there's
now
no need.
it revived for various reasons in many of the other agriculturally viable countries, Jamaica, Antigua, and so on, St. Kitts. It never did in those marginal agricultural countries of the other Caribbean. Now, which countries constitute the other Caribbean? The Virgin Islands colony, Turks and Caicos, Caymans, Anguilla, all of which have subsequently carved out a similar path of development, which variously has been focused on a combination of, well, historically the fishing, the marine-oriented, seafaring. More recently, tourism and financial services. That's the other Caribbean.
Okay. So in terms of where, because of the, I guess, the plantation era, so to speak, the government was in control of those lands for a longer period of time. That's why it never transferred to, say, those who were considered to be former slaves?
Well, no, I mean, in those countries where the plantations remained, or revived, plantation economy revived after a downturn. In many instances, the plantations really never fell out or never transferred out of the ownership of the planter class or their descendants. I mean, you know, take St. Kitts, for example. I mean, the sugar, I mean, it's only fairly recently that
with the closure of the
that's
factory.
Right, that's right. And that obtained in much of the rest of the Caribbean, where agriculture, King Sugar remained a viable proposition until fairly recently. That simply wasn't the case here, or Anguilla, or Turks and Caicos, or the Caymans. King Sugar never revived once it was dealt the death knell at the end of the 19th century.
So in light of that, it's almost as if that was a blessing in disguise, so to speak, because then when the plantations were sold off to the locals, then the ownership became more, I guess, across the board, in terms of, instead of a minority holding most of the land, you had a majority holding the land.
Yes,
having access to
and of course what the Virgin Islands colony has been described also as being that period which followed the end of the plantation era up until the advent of tourism, as being a land-rich but cash-poor economy. And that's true. I mean, there was widespread land ownership. There still is, by and large.
Yeah.
But that early period was one in which you had the land, but it was not considered to have been worth very much until tourism came on scene.
Into scene, yeah. So we transitioned then into the service industry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. One aspect of the sequel to slavery you referred to was where you talked about an economic and constitutional retrogression. What do you mean by that?
Well, after the demise of the plantation economy, with the economy in continued decline, there was a concomitant cutting back of social services. The government itself was progressively constrained, so that, for example, by the mid-1800s, you had a situation where the membership of the legislature, the Legislative Council, was reduced, I think, from 6 to 4 in the 1850s. Subsequent, a few years later, elections were abolished. Sometime later, the LegCo itself was abolished in 1902, and it was not reestablished until 1950, the result of popular agitation. The persons who were leaders of that movement memorialized in statuary outside of the council chambers now. Faulkner, De Castro, Fonseca, and so on. So that's that period. In conjunction with that, at the same time, you had a period where social services, the bureaucracy was also progressively cut back, so that you had positions within the civil service which were either abolished because they were simply, the economy couldn't sustain them. They were either abolished or they were amalgamated, so that you had posts. You might have
multiple functions.
Well, you had multiple functions which were, you had different positions which were combined into
one.
That's right. For economic reasons.
So this was where the period of time when we were being administrated out of either Antigua or St. Kitts.
That's right, yes.
Okay, as part of the Federation.
The Leeward Islands, yes.
The Leeward Islands Federation.
Or the Leeward Islands Colony, yes.
Okay, that was part of it.
Yes.
That's interesting. And again, this is why I want to see Virgin Islands history from primary school, because a lot of this stuff I'm learning now for the first time that, I think is important that in 2011, I think it was, I read both the biography of J.R. O'Neill as well as H.R. Penn. And, it was like eye-opening in terms of the political revolution, I would refer to it as, in terms of, agitating, doing the demonstrations to bring back a council locally in terms of, having representation on island rather than someone a couple 100 miles away that really isn't paying attention to you unless, something probably drastic has to happen. So I think that's very important in terms of knowing these types of milestones in our history and how we came into being in terms of what we have today. So what we'll do now, we'll take a break, get a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. You've been tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith, and we will have a word from our sponsors and be right back. Welcome back. You're tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith, and with me this evening I have Dr. Michael O'Neill, who's been sharing with us from his book, Slavery, Smallholding and Tourism, Social Transformations in the British Virgin Islands. So we were just talking about, I guess kind of like the dark ages of the BVI, that 100 years before we started to move into the tourism. You made also a reference to this period in terms of the development of the dependent relations we had with the Danish West Indies. And for those that may not know, that's who we call today the U.S. Virgin Islands, or our next door neighbors. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, as the economy declined in the Virgin Islands colony, and with a hat off to Donald De Castro, because by the way, the book uses the term Virgin Islands colony where historically it refers, appropriate, and uses the British Virgin Islands latterly, particularly to make the distinction with what then became the U.S. Virgin
U.S.
Islands.
Virgin
But in
Islands.
any case, as the Virgin Islands economy declined, what began to emerge was an increasing dependence on the Danish West, particularly St. Thomas. Now, St. Thomas was historically, I would suggest what St. Thomas is. It was always a bustling entrepot, a bustling commercial center. When in 1819, the Royal Mail Packet Service, the shipping company, which was based here, when the facilities of the Royal Mail was damaged, facilities were damaged by a hurricane in 1819, it removed to St. Thomas.
Okay.
That then meant that connection with the outside world in terms of shipping for both cargo and passenger transport was lost and moved to St. Thomas.
Okay.
In 1847, the financial trading firm of Reed, Irving and Company, which was based here, a financial services company of the day, if you will, they removed themselves to St. Thomas, which meant that there was no longer any financial services of the era based in Tortola any longer. So that, you know, in order to take advantage, or to not to take advantage of, but to access financial services, one had to deal with St. Thomas.
When you say financial services, we're talking about like banking?
Yes, I mean, they did various things, Reed Irving. And interestingly, by the way, during the mid-1800s, of a dozen or so major commercial entities in St. Thomas, Charlotte Amalia, about a third of those were British owned. So it's interesting, you know. But the irony is that, if you will, while history may not repeat itself, as someone else said, it may rhyme. And we see, for example, remember a few years ago, we lost American Eagle, American Airlines serving us, so that we're now back to depending on St. Thomas, to a large extent for airlift. Go back to 1819, the loss of the Royal Mail caused the dependence of the territory on St. Thomas with respect to shipping, passenger transportation, and so on. So again, as I say, while history may not exactly repeat itself, it rhymes.
It comes close. Yes. Comes very close.
So that's what I meant by the dependence on the Danish. Now, there's an interesting aspect to this as well. A further irony is that while the Virgin Islands, BVI, became dependent on the Danish West Indies, particularly via St. Thomas, the irony is that the Danish West Indies itself, St. Thomas, was a colony of Denmark. So you have, in effect, what is, for lack of a, not for lack of a better term, but you have developing a situation of what might be termed subcolonization. St. Thomas being, the Danish West Indies being a colony of Denmark, and in a sense, in terms of the relationship, the British Virgin Islands, or the Virgin Islands colony, coming into a kind of a sub-colonial relationship with the Danish West Indies because of its dependence on
each other. So, and this is interesting, because then now I was thinking about when because of the level of trade between the islands, that permission was sought to spend the US dollar, but then that was actually after they were bought by the USA and became the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Well, you know, historically, given that close relationship of dependence that evolved between the Virgin Islands colony and the Danish West Indies in the first instance, when the Danish krone was the currency in circulation in the Danish West Indies, St. Thomas in particular, the Danish krone was in circulation here as well. In fact, I remember my late uncle Eugene, when he had a little museum, had samples of the Danish krone, what were also called cut quartz, in his museum. So that whatever took place in the next door, in a sense, affected here in terms of the currency in circulation.
Yeah.
Because after 1917, when the U.S. purchased the Danish West Indies and they became the U.S. Virgin Islands, the currency that de facto became in circulation here was the U.S. dollar. De jure, it became legal tender later on.
Okay. But it was basically we were trading with both currencies. It would have been the U.S. dollar as well as the pound.
Well, in point of fact, I mean, certainly, in my boyhood, I don't recall. I mean, the fact was that it was mainly the U.S. dollar which was in circulation.
Okay. Okay. As far as what was utilized, that's interesting. But that relationship, I think, still exists today, and I guess it's something for the governments of the day to look at how it will continue to evolve, because it will always exist. From what I see in terms of what history has taught us and how we make sure it's mutually beneficial, as it were, going forward in the development between the two countries.
Well, it has taken different turns and developments. I mean, and it depends to some extent on the economic fortunes of each side of Drake's Channel. During the Farrelly era, the era of the late Governor Farrelly, there was a particular move then, which was carried on by some of his successors, to emphasize the inter-Virgin Islands cooperation. Farrelly, I think, was the governor over on the other side who began referring to the Greater Virgin Islands.
Okay.
And so it has waxed and waned, but the close relationship clearly is historic and remains a crucial aspect of inter-Virgin Islands relations.
Okay. Yeah, that one is definitely, there's a sequel to that, as far as more to come. Okay, it's been suggested in the book where you were talking about, we touched on this earlier, as far as the abolition of the BVI legislature in 1902 and its reconstitution in 1950, that there was little development of any sort back in the Virgin Islands colony. And then at the point we begin to see the beginnings to a turn to tourism as a development strategy. I remember reading about this as part of the Foot report, where they were talking about, what are the options in terms of how do we get the economy at that time to grow and become, I guess, subsistent in terms of coming off of grant and aid with the UK government. So we can see there were a number of development plans as well as constitutional reform. Could you speak to how that began to emerge?
Well, a couple of things. One, at the end of, after World War II, the former imperial powers began to look at alternative ways of developing, of development in the rest of the world. And what began to emerge in entities such as the United Nations and the OECD was a turn to tourism as a development strategy of choice. So that's one aspect.
Okay.
Other aspect that began to emerge, post World War II, was later on the development of jet travel, which made travel long distances cheaper and well, somewhat cheaper and certainly more feasible.
And accessible to more people.
That's right. But I would suggest that the pivotal occurrence that led to the development of tourism in the rest of the Caribbean outside of Cuba was the revolution in Cuba of 1959, which closed off Cuba as tourism mecca for North America, for the North American market. At that point, much of the Cuban tourist market moved in first instance to the Bahamas, the casinos and so on, which were next door. But it subsequently spread throughout the region, not immediately and not with the same intensity in our parts of the region. But certainly immediately next door in the U.S. Virgin Islands, you began to see an increase in tourism. So that because of that, looking next door, in 1953, the Virgin Islands legislature, LegCo, passed the Hotel Aid Ordinance. The idea or the intention of which was to promote
hotel development.
Right. It's 1953. Now, that happened in 1953, but it was not without some ambivalence. There was still ambivalence about what was the best way to develop the Virgin Islands colony. So in 1958, you see a study or a report called by Frampton Biggs, which suggested a re-emphasis on the development of agriculture.
Okay.
But that ultimately didn't really go very far. And so in 1962, you have a study commissioned, and the study was done by Dr. Carleen O'Loughlin, who was then based at the University of the West Indies.
Okay.
And she was commissioned to produce, if I remember the title of the study correctly, it was a survey of the economic, potential, fiscal, structure and capital requirements of the British Virgin Islands. And that study, I would suggest, is a pivotal study with respect to the beginning of development planning in the British Virgin Islands.
Okay.
Because that was the beginning of a deliberate move away from the, if you will, the attempts to flog what was in many respects the dead horse of agriculture in terms of a development
strategy going forward,
and beginning to look at tourism for ill or better or ill. And in fact, with the legislature regarding the recommendations of the O'Loughlin report with favor and considering it, in quotes, firm policy going forward, that was the beginning of, and then in 1964, you have the completion of Little Dix in Virgin Gorda, Lawrence Rockefeller's Little Dix, which I would suggest is the marker of the beginning of tourism as we know it in the Virgin Islands colony.
So that was the first major, in terms of hotel development, that we had in the BVI at the time.
That's right. That's right. A watershed moment, if you will, in Virgin Islands history. It was, of course, at the time a relatively, I mean, not in retrospect, it was a relatively small hotel, but at the time it was a big development. It was, I think, some 50-something or 60 or so rooms, which was big at the time. But moreover, it was built at a cost, I think something like $7.5 million, which at that time was unheard of. So, as an economist, I think it may have been an economist to whom I'd like to refer in a minute, Dr. William Phillips, who came here from the UN. I think he made the comment that the case of Little Dix showed what a tremendous impact a small development of just however many rooms, 50-something rooms, could have in an economy the size of the Virgin Islands colony.
That's interesting. And yes, you did mention in the book in terms of there was a development plan that was drafted by Dr. Phillips in terms of recommendations on measures to accelerate the economic and social development. What was the significance of that plan?
Well, again, I think the Phillips report, or the Phillips plan, is another pivotal moment in the evolution of development planning in the Virgin Islands colony. Because it marks the moment at which, with the concurrence and acceptance of the recommendations of that plan by the Development Advisory Commission or Committee, which was chaired at the time by the late attorney McWilling Todman, and more particularly by the government, it marked the beginning, or it set the stage for the infrastructural development which we kind of see even now. As a result of the recommendations of the Phillips report, you began to see, or the government began to move with alacrity on such infrastructural works as the Deepwater Harbor, which was done as a public-private project, the electrification throughout the country, road works throughout the country. The road to West End was done. the expansion of the airstrip, telecommunications expansion.
Okay.
All of this began to take place in fulfilling the recommendations. I mean, it was an amazing, in my view, putting into place or carrying out the recommendations of a plan. And you know, you see the outcome even now. I mean, much of the infrastructure that exists today had its beginnings
initiated there
in the 1960s, the late 1960s, following the Phillips report of 1966.
Okay, that's interesting. And even now, still, we need a development plan as far as taking us to that next stage of our development.
I don't know how our time is going, but I think that some of these plans, certainly the Phillips plan, and one which, if we have time, the Shanklin-Cox report, if we get to that.
Actually, we could touch on that now.
Yeah. Well, what happened then after the, I guess in the latter part of the 60s, you had, and again, it's consistent with the Phillips report and those sorts, and the development planning thrust of the time, part of which emphasized the need for foreign directed investment, as we would now call it. I don't think the term was particularly used then, but the attraction of outside investors, the most significant of which was the Bait Hill Company Limited, which on the basis,
quite a store.
Exactly, on the basis of considerable concessions granted it by government, set out to develop Wickham's Key and Anegada based on what became known as the Bait Hill and the Wickham's Key and Anegada development agreement. That was in 1967. As a result of what were considered to be the extraordinary concessions given to Bait Hill Limited, they emerged considerable public outcry, feeling that government was giving away the country, and so on. And out of that emerged the positive action movement, political agitation, popular agitation, the result of which was the abrogation of the agreements, the Bait Hill Limited agreements, Anegada and Wickham's Key. And government ended up, with the abrogation of the agreements, purchasing the
land back.
Land back, yes, with a loan from the British government. Now, so this then leads you to the 1970s, where you have a worldwide economic recession, not unlike perhaps somewhat different, but similarities to the one we've just gone through, or still going through, depending on where you live. And so at that point, there was a decline in development activity again, much of which was blamed on the outside, at least, on the government's abrogation of the agreements, saying there was a loss of confidence in the country and so on and so forth. But in fact, it could be, the blame really resided externally to a larger extent, the worldwide recession that occurred at the time. But in any event, coming out of that period, there was a relook, if you will, at development strategy going forward. And the government commissioned a firm called Shanklin-Cox to take a look at Wickham's Key and how best to develop it. And so the Shanklin-Cox report of 1972 was completed, and among other things it recommended, and crucially, it recommended that the development going forward focus primarily on the development of charter boat tourism, the bareboat,
the yachting industry.
And so that basically set the stage for what for a long time really was the primary mode of economic development for the territory. You know, that is the reason why the country became known or touted itself as the yachting center of the Caribbean. It still does, I think. So I guess the point I was going to make out of part of your question earlier was that I think, well, not your question, but your observation about the importance of
development
plans. I think that maybe some of these plans, like Shanklin-Cox in particular, may deserve being dusted off. Not that they apply to whole cloth now, but they are significant moments in the development strategy that emerged in this country, and I think may hold some useful lessons and perspectives as we face the as we arrive at the current inflection point in our history.
Yeah, and that was something, segue, and then we're going to wrap up. As far as in the article in BVI Property Guide, there was an article that was done in, I believe it was in 2012, September. And in it, it made reference to a speaker at a tourism symposium, I think it was 30 years ago from then, that we have to be careful of unplanned growth within the territory, and that we are at a similar inflection point, both in terms of the worldwide economic environment of recession in which it operates, and that you had expressed that, again, we need to look at, what's the development strategy and the direction that we need to look at. What are our critical issues? Again, we're still talking about the airport, access, the importance to our industries that we have, and also looking, beyond what would be future industries that we possibly need to be, planning for, and putting the infrastructure in place for those things. What do you see in terms of the future development of the country, and as any other closing thoughts that you have?
Well, you're referring just now, that piece you referred to, it was published in 2012. It was actually a review of the book. And I said then, and I repeat now in answer to your question, I think the BVI has been most successful when it is able to adroitly position itself in a way of exploiting niches on what I call the interstices of the global economy, whether they be charter boat tourism within the larger schema of tourism, or the sorts of specialized financial services which the BVI has carved out, but which are now on the onslaught from the very countries which recommended that this was the development strategy. So that what emerges, I think, is that the lesson is that the BVI has to continually be strategically agile. And the corollary to that strategic agility is constant innovation.
Reinventing ourselves, as you will.
Indeed.
As
and perhaps there's been, this is not original to me, but rather there's been a recent article by, I'm blocking his name now, I'm blocking his name, but basically the argument is that the Caribbean as a whole, and certainly places like BVI, may be not paying enough attention to the possibilities that exist on the development of services. What exactly that means is an open-ended question. But the move to services is probably what is going to have to be necessary. Of course, financial services has been an aspect of that. And tourism, of course, is a different kind of service. But I think what this particular scholar is referring to is moving into services which perhaps we haven't thought about yet.
Yep, and as with globalization being one of those trends, as it were, that came on the scene a few decades ago, that the world has shrunk, so we're no longer an outpost to anything. As a matter of fact, persons can get on a plane and be here in a matter of hours in terms of doing business of any kind. So it's very key that we look at what will the BVI be in the next 20 years, and how do we get there. So what are your closing thoughts?
Well, when I set out to write that book over a quarter century ago, one of my hopes was that it would have served to contribute to the body of knowledge which would be useful to Caribbean people in general, but more particularly to those of us who constitute what my colleague, anthropologist Ulf Hannert, refers to as this other Caribbean.
Other Caribbean.
And I still hope that there's some relevance even now, as particularly with the caveat being that, or if you will, the warning being that the danger lies in thinking that we each are so unique that we don't have lessons to learn
from one another.
Exactly. And I suspect that this other Caribbean, BVI, Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, Caymans, because of the historical path that we have trod, continue to face similar challenges, and probably the solutions are going to be not that dissimilar.
Very key. Well, Dr. O'Neill, I thank you for being here and sharing your wealth of knowledge. Again, we're encouraging everyone to get a copy of the book, Slavery, Smallholding and Tourism. It's available at many of our local bookstores as well as online. So for those that have your Kindles, go ahead and download it tonight and start reading. Dr. O'Neill, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith, saying let us continue the change in conversation for a better Virgin Islands.